The Astrazeneca COVID vaccine has been a subject of controversy over the past couple of years. It was never approved here in the US, but was offered around the world as a cheaper, easier to access alternative to Pfizer and Moderna. However, scandal soon followed in its wake. Back in 2021, a story by Reuters broke into the mainstream, exposing that millions of doses of AstraZeneca's COVID-19 vaccine that were shipped to Canada and Mexico and offered to the public was done so without health officials properly inspecting the operations of the U.S. manufacturer. According to the Reuters story at the time, in late March of 2021, under pressure to help other nations access COVID-19 vaccines, the Biden administration released 1.5 million AstraZeneca doses to Canada and 2.5 million to Mexico. Regulators in both countries told Reuters that European regulators had certified Emergent's factory as complying with, quote, good manufacturing practices, and on that basis, both Canada and Mexico began using the vaccine. But the European Medicines Agency, or the EMA, told Reuters that the certification was based on a remote inspection that focused on a part of the facility that was not actually producing the AstraZeneca shots. The FDA inspectors would eventually get around to documenting the unsanitary conditions as well as poorly trained staff at the plant, and so it was shut down for a time. After the story went public, the vaccine was suspended from use in over a dozen countries, and now in 2023, even the UK is discontinuing its use in their country. Of course, despite the vaccine no longer being offered, the public message about the safety of the vaccines continues to be that the side effects like blood clots or ischemic stroke following vaccination have happened but are very rare. The government of the UK points to a study by the University of Oxford which shows that having COVID-19 puts you at a much greater risk of developing blood clots than the AstraZeneca or Pfizer vaccines. For example, the study suggests for every 10 million people vaccinated with AstraZeneca COVID vaccine, there are 66 extra cases of blood clots in the veins and 7 extra cases of a rare type of blood clot in the brain. However, the study estimates a much higher rate for those who contract COVID-19, and they use this to suggest that the benefits of the vaccine far outweigh the risks for most people. That being said, people have been injured. And what about that contaminated factory that millions of doses were imported from? Well, to talk about this, we have one such man who has claimed to be one of these people affected by the AstraZeneca vaccine in Canada, Steve Johnson, as well as Trial Site News founder Daniel O'Connor, who will be joining us for this conversation. So, gentlemen, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Now, Steve, when you contacted us, you said you had an adverse reaction to the AstraZeneca vaccine. Can you tell us exactly what happened here?
Sure, yeah. So just a bit of preface. April 24th, 2021, I was working full time. I was very active. I did biking. I cross country skied. I had no underlying health conditions to my knowledge. I took the AstraZeneca vaccine on April 25th, 2021. And then the next morning, I woke up with numbness and tingling in my hand and my foot. And I immediately reported it to the doctor and went to emergency, make sure it wasn't thrombosis. And just to speed up the story a little bit, in the last 2 years, I've seen numerous neurologists, infectious disease specialists, internists, and I haven't been able to get an answer here in Canada. And now, unfortunately, the numbness and tingling has spread all over my body. I have tinnitus. I've got hearing loss. I've got documented asthma, which I never had before, and I also I had to go to another country in order to get medical help, and I saw a top specialist, and I have a documented case now of Sjogren's syndrome, which is basically an autoimmune disease. So the thesis is that perhaps the AstraZeneca vaccine prompted an autoimmune reaction in my body, leading to Sjogren's syndrome.
Well, Stephen, we definitely appreciate you joining. You can imagine we hear about a lot of comparable cases, and with the AstraZeneca vaccine, there are known side effects. We know others that have neurological challenges that you're raising. I'd like to again, we're express our sorrow that you have to go through this problem and not get the help that you need. And unfortunately, this is a problem, as you know, all over North America and beyond.
Right.
If we look at, tell us a little bit more. When you first got vaccinated, like how long did it take before the symptoms started?
Well, see, that was the thing. For me, it started the next morning. So the whole, I've had a few doctors try and pin it on the whole causation doesn't equal correlation thing. And I was like, my argument was, well, I've been alive for 48 years up to that point, and I take a medical procedure, and then the next morning I wake up with like numbness and tingling in my hand and my foot. It just doesn't add up totally, right? And then it progressed slowly. It's been what I compare it to. It's like an hourglass with the little sand falling. It's been a progressive disease for me, unfortunately. And it by October 2021, I was having tingling all over my body. I started to get tinnitus. I had a audio ear appointment, and the specialist said, "Oh, do you work for the military or something?" Because I had that much hearing loss, and I work in a library in Ottawa. So there was, my symptoms just didn't correlate. I don't really smoke. I don't smoke. I don't drink. So my symptoms didn't correlate to, to any other external factor. And then, I've been off work for a year and a half because, I have, like I was saying, I have numbness and tingling all over my body. I have internal tremors, which, unless you're vax injured, is hard to understand, but that's a very common, I don't have visible, I'm not like a Parkinson's patient, and I have more or less motor skills, but even as I'm sitting here talking with you, my ears are ringing. I feel, and it's not nerves or anything. If I sit for any period of time, I feel like an internal tremor going on.
Yeah, it's very, very difficult. Now, and from our understanding, when you first sought out help, were any of the physicians that you encountered in Canada open to, clearly there was very temporal association between the vaccine and these incidents. I mean, literally it's the next morning it starts.
Yeah.
How was the reaction by the first doctors that you met with? Was there any openness to consider that this was a serious adverse reaction to the vaccine?
My family doctor's always been incredibly supportive, I would say. No, and at first some of the specialists were a bit open to it, but then it seemed as time went on, there was, it quickly became evident that there was a reticence to link the two together. So no, I've had a very, and by this point, honestly, I don't really, I have now a documented case of the Sjogren's syndrome. So, I'm at the point now, I know what it is, whatever, but I just want to get treatment. That's all I care about, man,
Yeah, totally. So, and I want to get into the batch and the things that you've discovered, but
sure.
On the treatment, have you found specialists that are making progress with the situation?
I'll be honest. I had to go to another country I saw some top specialists in Mexico who are rheumatologists and neurologists who are top in their field in the city there. And they were able to provide, via lip biopsy, they were able to provide me more of an idea of what I most likely have. That doesn't mean I still have to do follow-up tests, blood work, but I feel now at least I'm on a pathway perhaps to some real treatment.
Yeah, and that's great, but it's telling that you had to go all the way to Mexico from Canada to get care.
Yeah, I'm not, and the thing is too, man, I'm not the only story in Canada. Unfortunately, I would say probably most, like, I know, without mentioning names, obviously, but I know people in the medical field, whether as researchers or students or or nurses, who've been medically, who were injured by Pfizer, Moderna, whatever, Astrazeneca, and it's been tough for all of us to get medical help. I'm in desperate need of medical help, frankly, and that's what I'm having to, I'll go anywhere, frankly, to try and get that help I need. I have to spend my life savings even, right? Because if I'm not okay physically, then of course I'm not able to work my job. I'm not able to be the father I want to be, the husband I want to be. So yeah, that's my scenario right now.
But what really, got our attention with your case, obviously it's, we our heart goes out to you and everybody else.
Thank you.
Is the, what you've been able to really analyze, and that is that, this batch of AstraZeneca vaccine that went to both Canada and another one went to Mexico was produced in this emergent biosolution production facility in Baltimore. And we've written about, we know that there are problems there. I frankly didn't know the severity of the problems until you brought it to our attention. You have this really good timeline you put together. You want to share with the audience what you've learned, kind of summarizing, how this product made its way up to Canada.
So basically, when I took the vaccine too, I had assumed all the proper checks and balances had been done. And what the situation was here in Canada in like early March 2021, there was extreme political pressure on the federal and provincial, like our states, governments to get more vaccines. We frankly had, and I did too, we had vaccine envy because we were seeing the rollout in the US and to a lesser extent in the UK. So we really wanted vaccines. And then the US, Joe Biden, I believe it was early March 2021, Joe Biden reached out, and I would assume there was a lot of back and forth beforehand, but he reached out and he offered us as a donation these 1.5 million doses to Canada and 2.5 million doses to Mexico. So then, the vaccine was brought to Canada, and there was at first there was a slow uptake, frankly, because there had been questions a little bit about blood clots and everything like that, and there was a lot of playing around too with the age levels here in Canada. Like for a while it was only over 55, and then it was, then when I took it, it was reduced down to April 19th, 2021. It was reduced to 40 and up. So there was, but the thing was, though, in the Canadian media, all we were hearing about was safe and effective. You have 1 in a million chance of getting a blood clot. We can't even associate the two together. At first, I was like, oh, it came from the US, thank goodness. Like, at least it wasn't, I don't mean this badly at all, but the other AstraZeneca was from India. And I just sort of assumed that the US would have had more oversight, more, whatever. And then I started looking at it and I thought, oh my gosh, this is a horror show. Because the situation was that the plant in Baltimore, they were producing Johnson and Johnson and AstraZeneca at the same time. And this wasn't obvious immediately, but this was into 2022. The factory had to get rid of over 500 million doses. And just to back up, like even before April 19th, 2021, the Canadian government would have had access to, there's a whole litany of articles in the New York Times predating this date that completely outline the many, many issues that factory had. For instance, the factory had to get rid of millions of doses of AstraZeneca prior to the date because of contamination issues. The point that I'm making is, so for instance, as I said, there were millions of doses from AstraZeneca that were contaminated. There was also information in the New York Times by that point about 15 million doses of Johnson & Johnson that were contaminated. So at a very, very minimum, this should have been a red flag for our health officials here in this country.
Yeah, well, I was going to say, just to interject, that there were other problems. So I want to just take a step back for a minute, just to provide some context for Canada, because you had mentioned vaccine envy. Remember, in the very early parts of the pandemic, the Canadian government, through, I believe it was Nova Scotia, but it was one of the eastern provinces, put a deal together with CanSino Biologics, a Chinese manufacturer of experimental COVID vaccine.
Right.
And that was a Canadian government strategy, to depend on the Chinese government for their flagship vaccine. It was out there, and TrialSite was two groups in the United States reporting on this. Long story short, what happened was Chinese customs never let that investigational product make its way to Canada. So the Canadians were left with nothing. And that's part of the reason why you had that sort of, quote, vaccine envy situation. Now, fast forward, my understanding is, and correct me if I'm incorrect here, but my understanding is here, we can't be sure that the batch that you received was tainted. We cannot be. We do know, we're pretty confident that you're injured because of that vaccine, however, number one. Number two, the Canadian authorities never audited or inspected that facility for that particular batch, nor did the Americans, correct?
I can tell you that the Canadian authorities didn't. The FDA had inspected the factory, I believe. But as you were talking about earlier, it came out July 29th, 2021, the Reuters article, that Canada and Mexico had largely accepted the doses from the AstraZeneca plant based on a European Union inspection of the factory. And the problem for that was that they had only inspected the Johnson & Johnson side of the factory, because the AstraZeneca doses from that factory weren't going to be sent to Europe. So they had never inspected the actual production side of AstraZeneca. So ultimately, to the best of my knowledge, Canada had largely accepted these doses of AstraZeneca based on the good word of the company, which, seems to be like beyond the pale.
If that is true, and again, we've reviewed some of the material, and we can't be certain, but if it is true, I mean, that's pretty outrageous, in that there's just gross negligence when it comes to quality controls, audit, reviews.
Yeah.
I mean, it's unacceptable. You can't put medical products into the stream of commerce without proper quality control. This is a fundamental problem. Okay.
Yeah.
We're taking what you've brought to us very seriously. We're looking into the matter carefully.
Yeah.
The fact that the Johnson and Johnson and AstraZeneca vaccines were potentially, cross-pollinated, mixed together. That's, outrageous.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Something I wanted to bring forward.
Yeah.
So, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but
no, please.
yeah. So I'll give you a scenario. There was, and let me preface this too. You've mentioned my document. Everything, and you would know this from looking at it, but everything I've cited is from sources like the New York Times, one of our major national newspapers, the National Post. It's of similar status to maybe like a Washington Post or USA Today. So everything I'm bringing forward, this isn't from the dark reaches of some Rumble podcast that has like 10 views or something. And so I'll give you an example how crazy it is. The April 19th, 2021, the same day that AstraZeneca was approved for use in Ontario for 40 and up, and it was also allowed from our National Advisory Committee on Immunization. They said, okay, we approved 40 and up. That's the national body. The FDA had actually gone in and shut down the factory. The same day that it was approved in Ontario for use in 40 and up, the FDA had to go in and shut down the factory because of poor manufacturing practices. And the part that really breaks my heart, frankly, is that in April 23rd, 2021, there was a major article in the National Post just talking about some of these issues at the factory. And in the article, there was a quote from a professor here in Ottawa, who I believe he's with public health policy, and he said, no one in Canada should be getting these doses of AstraZeneca. And the biggest issue I have, Daniel, is that we weren't being told this by our public health leaders up until this whole time. We had the constant talking medical heads coming on there saying, like a drumbeat, safe and effective. I would, if I had a chance, get your first vaccine. No. And then we had a very prominent person from the national, it was a committee, National Advisory Committee on Immunization. I'd have to look, but I think it was the chairperson or the vice chairperson. She went on a national TV news program on April 25th, 2021, and said, well, no, we would advise people to take a Pfizer or Moderna as their first choice, as the vaccine, and it was still being rolled out to the public, largely without, I bring this up to my friends who had AstraZeneca, and they don't know that, very likely that their dose came from a factory that had all these issues.
Yeah. And to your point, okay, so there was a lack of informed consent as to material quality problems that were ongoing and emerging injuries that were being reported, okay? Because we know from some of the folks like through React 19 that very early on in the pandemic, the National Institutes of Health and the Food and Drug Administration and the CDC, frankly, were aware of these injuries, okay? They're aware very early on of injuries, and they've actually been gaslighting and suppressing all along, okay? Now, back to this situation, part of this is the doctors, that were telling you, hey, go get that vaccine, get that vaccine. They may have not been aware.
Yeah, right. Yeah. No, I want.
Nobody told them.
No, exactly. There, they were, how do I put it? There was, I get it. We were in a major pandemic, and I'm not at all questioning COVID. I mean, that's off the table. I know it can be a very serious disease, right? But the issue that I would have had though is that, this information wasn't, what I would say, it wasn't readily accessible to the public, but this was in full view in, the national, let's call it the world newspaper of record, the New York Times, and this was also very predominantly being covered by a very good journalist at Politico.com too, so this wasn't like Health Canada officials would have had been rummaging in some obscure and there was FDA reports, and there was a paper trail already as early as March 2021 that should have put severe questions into the use of that vaccine by Canadian officials. And then one other point I wanted to raise too is that there would have been, by that point too, there would have been a wealth of data coming out of the UK showing, a very clear link probably between, AstraZeneca and blood clots, thrombosis, right? For instance, Denmark had suspended the use of the vaccine on April 19th, 2021.
Yeah, a bunch of the Nordic countries did.
Right, So I mean, how do I put it? I mean, no country is perfect, but I think most of us can assume that, Denmark and the Nordic countries have probably pretty stringent health, guidelines, right?
Well, remember, the United States never rolled out, as Adrian mentioned, or up front, the United States never accepted the AstraZeneca vaccine.
Right. And as you would know too, Daniel, I mean, for instance, Brie Dressen, who's a very high profile vaccine injured, one of the co-founders of React 19.
Yes.
I mean, her case, I believe, I don't want to get it wrong, but I don't think her case was even properly reported by AstraZeneca because she had a reaction after her first dose, and in order for them to have it put into the official documents, I think they had to say that you had needed 2 doses to complete the trial, So, I mean, there was, like I was saying, there was extreme issues surrounding, that vaccine. Yeah.
Yes. So, what we see here with your story is, what many people have gone through, and you see a systematic, in the context of a global pandemic and this rush to get these products out to the market, right?
Mm-hmm.
So basically the stance of regulators, apex research institutes, and public health agencies, that is, this is safe and effective, and any injuries are extremely rare. So therefore, we're good. Move it through. Okay.
Right.
And in that rush, informed consent of the type that we know we need from an ethical, moral, and even legal standpoint got forgotten.
Yeah.
Now, and then there's the victims of this, the people that are injured. And, that's why TrialSite, as a media organization, fledgling social network focusing on research, biomedical research, we take this very important. You have to have trust. Us in a society, must trust the public health agencies, the regulators, the apex research institutes, the health systems. If we don't trust these organizations, we have a big problem.
What I'm trying to bring forward is I really want this investigated by our parliamentary committee on health, because, unfortunately, this specific issue hasn't been raised at the public health committee level federally. It hasn't been raised extensively by any of our three major political parties. I won't say the publication, but I was extremely close to having a national news story printed on this, or a national news story come out on this by a very credible, reputable journalist. And at the last minute, the particular journalist said that their editors weren't able to go ahead because they didn't want to associate causation necessarily with, the factory.
It's a real problem. And I want to ask you about the Canadian government and any investigations. But, if we look at coverage of these problems, and again, I'm biased, I'm part of Trial Site. So I'm going to tell you that I believe we're one of the more objective, unbiased platforms. I mean, we report on both the good news about these vaccines, and there have been good news too, and the bad. And the problem is you have this polarization now, Stephen, where you have, on the one hand, mainstream media, and they really don't touch us. They're starting to report on vaccine injuries, but it's still a very rare occurrence. And but they are kind of slowly thawing, warming up to at least talking about it. But we're still a ways away from having real investigative journalistic coverage. On the other hand, you have these more right-leaning media, and they're kind of biased. They're exploiting this coverage in their coverage. The vaccines do no right. They do nothing but wrong. And, they're monetizing traffic. And, it's a business. That's what you do. But, we really try to keep objective. Okay. We really try to keep objective.
Right.
It's just a messy situation. This. Now, if you look at the Canadian government, and has there been any have any elected officials worked with you to try to launch some investigation into this?
The short answer is no. I've had productive meetings with a member of parliament, and I really appreciate his, their effort. But
so if we look at the situation, it's difficult, the geography, dispersed population, you've got the political polarizations that are up there as well as down the states. And you still have the government, in this sort of, I don't want to say cover up mode's kind of an extreme term, but some kind of mode that's not acknowledging the true extent of the problem.
I'll never look at Health Canada the same way again. I'll never look at what people are telling me on the media again the same way. I hate to be this way, but I've become very cynical in some ways. And
so have I, and so have a lot of us at Trial Site and elsewhere. I mean, I think what we're seeing is and this has been building over the decades. There's a systematic permeation of industry culture into government, and government agencies depend on industry filing fees and so forth, and so you have a revolving door of leadership. So it's the lines blur, and when there is a major talking point that everybody buys into, even if there's a bunch of messiness below that they should be talking about, they just made the decision. Let's just talk about this good, rosy, cheery stuff. We've got this deadly pandemic that's threatening us. And, if we talk about this, the dirt under the carpet, then we might scare people. Problem is now they're scaring us worse. So, I don't trust, and I'm with you, Steve. I don't trust these government agencies. I know there's good people in there. I know they've reached out to us. Okay. There are good people buried in these agencies that want change.
Of course, yeah.
So anyway, let's do this. Let's keep in touch. We'd love to have you on again. We'll keep digging into some of these stories around the emergent plant. What we try to verify some of these things for certain in terms of like making sure, hey, no agency ever inspected this batch, right? It was,
Sure. And that'd be wonderful. Yeah. Well, thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to be on your podcast. And I really do appreciate the work that, you guys are doing to try and bring some light to all sides of the topic. So
we appreciate it. Thank you so much, Stephen.